Hello, hello. Welcome to this edition of the Law Firm Blueprint. I'm one of your hosts, Jay Ruane. And with me, as always, is my guy, Seth Price, down there in DC, Maryland, and Virginia. Seth, this week we had a big storm here on the East Coast. Did you get snow down there or did you get
We
rain?
we woke up to nothing despite a 2-hour school delay. And then there was like flakes for a bit. I think up county it was pretty bad. And we live in a
Gotcha.
very large county. It's about 45 minutes to drive to the other end of the county. That said, when I'm in charge, there'll be two zones, zone A and zone B. Zone A gets a lot of snow. Zone B doesn't and has underground, has a lot of the wires are underground, et cetera. And the idea that we can't close schools differently for different sides of the county blows my mind.
Well, I mean, they called off our schools the day before,
No, understood when you have something
because
major. What
yeah,
I'm
we
saying
got
right
10
now
inches.
is there was not enough to delay the schools where I live, but somewhere in the county it was, and they don't make a distinction.
Yeah, that was like the high school that I went to. We drew people from two different counties to go to my high school. So if there was snow anywhere, we got the day off. So it was kind of nice. I liked that as a kid. It's just those are the fond memories because right now, with this week, everybody in my office just worked from home. They had to, and that brings me up to the topic that I want to talk about with the show this week is that everybody in my office, they have laptops, they have phones at home, they have VoIP service, or they have a soft phone on their laptop. They can do what needs to be done, right? And we've had this vendor for 15 years pre-COVID. I mean, we were set up pre-COVID. This is all good stuff, right? But the question I have, and the thing that I want to talk about is at what point is it time to move on from a vendor? Maybe they're doing everything right, but you just say, hey, you know what? I wanted like for example, and this is something that maybe you could talk to on the Blue Shark side, but also from the Price Benowitz side. There are people who I am sure in a marketing world have outsourced to Blue Shark and then said, you know what, we've grown, we've scaled. Now we want to manage things internally and we want to do some things internally. We're bringing our content writers in and that type of thing. Same thing for me. Like I've got a working phone system. It works internationally. Everybody seems to be, but should I be looking at moving maybe an upgrade, so maybe it's a tech upgrade. Maybe it's, hey, I've got a local answering service. I got to go with a product like Capture Now, right? Because they can provide something that the local answering service, who's one person or maybe one and a half people working out of their local house, they've been answering phones for years, can't handle anymore, given the volume of calls that we have coming in. So these are the questions that I think people have as they grow, and it's nothing personal against the vendor necessarily. It's just you're going in a particular direction and your time with them is done. What are your thoughts
Right.
on
So
that?
look, a lot because a gazillion vendors at Price Benowitz that we work
Right.
with. As Blue Shark, I see it from the other side. So I see all sorts of stuff. And I think marketing's slightly different than technology, but different, but analogous. So let's
Right.
start unpacking this. I went through what you're doing with the phone system not that long ago. I don't know if I think we may even have at one point had the same group. I think it was a David Hanel office when I had a dozen people and we picked some phone system and have stayed with it for a very long time. Now, there's a couple truisms, right? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. You've heard that
Right.
before. There's only so many of these changes you could make at once where you may want to upgrade stuff, but your bandwidth, and depending on how much of an ops team you have or a technology team, you really want to have multiple things moving at the same time? Second
Right.
question, right? Third is price. Like there may be more, but are you willing to pay that upgrade? Right? And this is the ironic piece because I see it from the Blue Shark side. There are times when I started, we would get clients from people who were legendary, charged nothing. And in the marketing world, people stayed with them at that nothing rate for a very long time. And at some point, they wanted to spend more. And the question is, do you go back to your existing vendor and say, what can you do for a larger budget, which is nobody does, very few people do, versus do you just shop it to the world and say, well, this is my low dollar person, I'll spend more somewhere else now. And I see a lot of that. But to take your piece, we literally went through this, and I'll tell one old story, which I think would be illustrative to this crowd, which was so we're old enough that there was software that wasn't sold on a per seat license back in the day. I went, I think with you, to a DUI conference in Vegas, and our first software pre-Clio for our non-PI was something called Defender Data. And it was $60 a month, and we had 12 licenses. And it was very basic, but it did the job for a criminal practice.
Right.
And one day they looked at us and we had 60 licenses, and they're like, we're going to have to raise your rate. They called me. What's he's like, you're going from like, I think he went from like $60 a month to $80 a month. I can do that. So that was a good one, right? At some point we had, and again, very analogous to what you're doing with the phone system, we're like, look, it gets us through the day, but it's not the right answer for growth. And we moved our non-PI to Clio. And that was $60 a head. Massive difference. Was it the right move? It took us probably, if I'm being honest, 2 or 3 years before we started using the functionality to the point where I could justify the expense. But it was the right thing to do. Phone system. We started out with a David Hanel referral. I built and grew. It got to the point, especially with international, that it wasn't really untenable. But this is what we did. We went back to the person we were using and said, what else is there? And actually, there was, there you could go to, you would mentioned, there's Zoom, there's other groups that are doing it. There was one group that was on a legitimate list that was a direct technology swap with our current provider, where we didn't have to re-upload everything. It was
Oh,
just moving to a new platform. It was new hardware, mind you, but it wasn't
hardware can get expensive when you got that many desks.
correct. But ironically, it's now less expensive. Technology, the hardware is slightly less, but with the soft apps, that go on the computer, so many of our people don't even have the hardware now.
Right.
Old people like us want the hardware. So two things: the hardware became less expensive. Third parties work. So the biggest issue was would have been, and you see this with software. People moving from something to a Filevine or SmartAdvocate. That transition is so expensive that if there's an opportunity to build and grow within that group, that has to have a slight advantage over again, to me, that if I could make a jump, assuming that it was very, very close to what I'd want, that the idea that I don't need to do a full rebuild is
Yeah,
is
it's
a
huge.
nice luxury.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things is that a lot of us in this industry, we can get I guess tempted by the shiny object of technology or vendor. You meet somebody at a conference and you're like, oh, this person's going to solve all my problems, or this technology is going to solve all my problems. And you could hope that that happens. But the reality is that there's never going to be a perfect vendor or a perfect piece of technology. It's the question of how much are you using it. And that's a conversation that we're going to have on our leadership team is, our phones, are working. They're, everybody, we're
So
good.
what? So let me ask you, what do you want that you don't have? That's the question. What could you get from another system?
So I think from another system, it would allow us to deploy certain things in-house that right now we have to email our rep and say, hey, you need to change the ring pattern, or you need to
And
add an
and how much of an
extension and that type
obstacle
of
is
thing.
that for you?
It's sending an email.
Right, but meaning so essentially
Right. I mean,
that's not one of the, so for us we were going beyond the limitations of when you go over 100 seats, things change. And it was I
right.
think the group we had was good to 99, and we were pushing against it. So I think that to a certain extent, the piece that coming from a world of it ain't broke, don't fix it, going back to existing vendors, see what your options are. We've built and grew with the old phone system we
Right.
had, and that we are with a new one, but it was one that was on a similar platform. Look, I'm headed to tech show right after we finish this, and I have people, we see them at masterminds and conferences. It's usually smaller guys, and they switch their software. I see it outside the PI space in particular, where they're going from one to another every year
Yeah,
because
I
you
see that
know
too.
one doesn't do this and one doesn't do that. And after, I think that, look, you've been with the company 15 years. God bless. Go shop and see what functionality there is that you could upgrade to, right? Is it worth it? Great. But the flip side is I see a lot of people, the biggest mistake I see smaller people doing, saying that I was with my case, I went to Clio, didn't love Clio, now I'm with Practice Panther, but my case is doing something cool. And I'm like, none of it's going to solve all your problems.
Right.
They all are good or bad. Clio, which I love, right? I mean, I love, I don't want to overstate it. For 8 years, they told me there was an integration with QuickBooks that didn't exist. I mean, I don't know if it was 8 years, but for many, many years, finally, so there is not a panacea that we are at a point where we all create our own processes and systems that none of these softwares are going to do everything. And the phone system, you're going to find, let's say you went to Zoom, you're going to find out, oh, they can do this, but they can't do that.
Right.
And it's sort of like we're going back to your shiny object, making sure that you're making the decision for a purposeful reason. Like is the juice worth the squeeze?
Right. And that's reason why I wanted to talk about this today, because I feel a lot of people in the legal space, they are, I guess it's you're as a lawyer, somebody who should be who is trained to think about all of the different permutations and variations in case law and thinking through things strategically when you're writing a brief and all your training. It's like they get in front of people and they get sold a bill of goods very quickly. And really what we want to do is encourage people to say, figure out what you actually need and go there. I mean, for me, it's interesting. Everybody loves Filevine. I know you use it a
No,
lot.
I mean I like it, but I
I
don't
thought
use it.
oh, I thought you guys used it in one of your divisions.
No, we're smart
Oh,
advocate,
Smart
Clio. I mean,
Advocate. That's
again,
what
no,
you
no,
guys.
no. But that said, many of our friends and colleagues,
Yeah,
it's a great piece of software.
it is. I've seen it. I've used it, and for years I was like, maybe I need to move to Filevine. Maybe I need to move to Filevine, and I have been building our own software, which is another headache. Since I started, because Clio, Filevine, SmartAdvocate. None of these things existed when I started my practice and started, having multiple offices. So we had a server and it was server based and we were built, and it was a lot. And we had redundant backups. I mean, it was my tech stack years ago was very aggressively innovative, but it also was limited by what was out there. But we went to the cloud before other people had done that. But we've kept it all in house. And one of the people on my leadership team said, we brought it to me, said we owe it to ourselves to look into what it would be to take us to go to SmartAdvocate or Filevine and customize it. I said,
Well,
look at what we're spending every year on upgrades to our system that we know and love. And yes, it's not perfect, but we can have it do everything we want: automated text messaging, emails, file generation, document generation, tons of stuff, right? Um, and if you look at the per seat costs that it would cost us to move to something like Filevine, we'd be paying triple what we pay now in development costs.
right.
You know what I mean? And
Well,
is it worth it at that point?
right. And
Could
look,
be.
we've talked about this in prior. I know Umansky was part of this conversation back in the day. I'm a big fan of being out of the software business. Unless you're going to take it, it's a passion, you want to turn it and become that next software. Great. But if this is just your hobby, look, I also am a big fan of not being. I order off menu all the time.
I
I
know. I've been at
make
restaurants with you.
right? I'm speaking to some of my sort of coaching groups where I want to have a path of my own choosing that doesn't fit somebody else's program. I'm that guy, so I get it. That said, if you are a criminal practice and you're about to pay for and go through the headaches of taking a PI centric piece of software and adopting it to your world, if you say, hey, here's the build out for somebody who's doing what I'm doing, great. But for you to reinvent the wheel, that to me is the scariest thing. Could it be done? Absolutely.
Right.
But if the answer is that every other criminal guy is on a smoke ball, practice Panther Clio, or my case, why take something more complicated,
Right.
more expensive, and bring that down for what you're doing? Is it more custom? Maybe, but like, what do you really need it for? And that is sort of that's why, despite it being a pain in the ass, I never look. I also did it before there was anything even close. Now Clio's trying PI and Filevine's trying criminal and other things like that. But the idea is, I want somebody whose main. It's hard enough when it's their main focus. God forbid. I mean, look, I can speak to the SmartAdvocate people. Would they sell you a criminal for a criminal? Absolutely. Does it make any sense? I don't think so. I mean,
Right.
it's like, don't reinvent the wheel. Find out where it is. That's why when I see this, and I think that one of the smarter things that Filevine did was having the integrator team that was outside, like Salesforce. I just wish there was more practice in a box where you like Salesforce doesn't have that
Right.
where you can go and say, "Hey, I'm a criminal defense firm. Can you give me the basic setup?" Now, we're pains in the ass. We're going to change it, but at least you're starting with something that is industry
Right.
standard
Like
rather than what.
I don't need a tag for statute of limitations on a on a criminal defense practice
No, but right, but the idea is, but you
software.
do know you need to have like the hardest thing that I remember back in the day that nobody had was payment plans. That was the
Right.
hardest thing for 10 years. Probably why you built it yourself. Nobody
Right.
could handle payment plans. It was like you would think we're trying to go to Mars. Nobody until recently that this is at least, could do true QuickBooks integration. Like I remember Clio didn't have it, and they had it. There was a big exam, and it was turned out that if you had one user, it worked. But the moment there was a second user, it would create duplicate data. Not a good thing. And
Oh,
and and so also part of it is you hear a lot of truisms, and that's why this bouncing, I think, is the one thing. There are times, and then this isn't to say, hey, the Jay Ruane thing of betting on like your own tech stack, but the idea of like, yeah, your software may not be as good. Now, if it's something where your software doesn't have plaintiffs, the ability to do a plaintiff's case, doesn't have that in there, and you have to, Jimmy rig it, at some point, do you want to make a move? But I think that's also why Clio is good, like did something very smart. I'm friends with Jack Newton, and we've talked about it over time. He's the founder there, which is they have forced you to leave Clio historically. Is there right now, is their PI integration or their PI modular as good as the ones that are standalone for that? No, but like it'll get there. And if you look at like a friend of the show, like an Andy Gross, who had like a piece of it, it would allow people to stay with them much, much longer and maybe eventually forever if they could figure that piece out. It's just interesting. So I think that there's a certain amount of it's awesome to push the envelope. It's awesome to see what else is out there. I think that checking with existing vendors, because I'll give you another example. We use Jazz HR as our HR, for recruiting. We
right.
we have all the resumes, but we had a good relationship with them and spend a few $100s a month. It's not crazy. We would love to. We have this new amazing recruiter. She's been with us, long enough. I could say it, the 6 month J rule that like she's in there, and she comes and says, "This is really slow and it's really hurting my ability to do my job. We should really look at these others." And it turned out that there's another, like to the Toyota, there's a Lexus owned by the same company that's a much more advanced. And we look at it and it was like FU expensive. It turned out we just need to buy more storage within Jazz. And now all of a sudden it's running fine. So asking questions that imagine if I was going to like totally move that piece of my tech stack,
Right.
that would be a
Which
huge
is
do
part of my
very.
point. Like you need to. I feel like some people react reflexively rather than logically, and they just say, "Okay, well, it's time to get a new one," and they just jump. Maybe they were sold a bill of goods at a trade show. Maybe they met somebody who they were charmed by. But maybe they just aren't putting the time of care and attention into those decisions that they would do for things like their clients. And your law firm is a client of yours as the CEO, and you should be making these informed decisions.
Isn't it similar to an employee to a certain extent? I mean, I remember when before I had my law firm, I was working in the tech space, and a buddy of mine would hire people and he'd talk about his new hires like you would be like your love interest. They can do this, they can do that, and that's going to solve all my problems. And you realize they're human beings. They have strengths, they have weaknesses. And I think it's not unlike here. And there are times where an existing person with the right training and development could do a really good job. And there are times when we're like, what can we do from the outside rather than investing in our current people, and or just, we talking about looking at vendors as partners, something we talk a lot about, which is do you have enough of a relationship with them where you not just with the rep that's getting you through the day, but do you know the person a couple levels up that knows what's possible? Because like most things, like most of these softwares we're using, there's so much power beyond what we're actually using it for. And this is a lot of times you get to the point where there's something your software can't do. I can't tell you for how many years I had people before I even had overseas cutting and pasting information because there wasn't a perfect integration. And am I smart for like not bouncing software? Would have been better to have found? I don't know, but it is. I think that it's not the drug that new software is going to change and rock your world is can be enticing. There are times when it's right. I've seen law firms that move to Alidify, Filevine, SmartAdvocate that's changed their entire practice and it was the right move. But the bouncing between them to me is a red flag that you got to be careful that like it's sort of like relationships that like no one person is going to hit everything and that the question is can you live with the shortcomings?
Yeah, I mean it's really it's and that leads me to, the second part of the conversation is at what point do you say to yourself, I'm reevaluating the people that I'm doing business with? Is it your cleaning people? Is it your landlord? Is it your, is for in Blue Shark's purposes, is it your SEO team? Is it, because everybody has a skill set, right? And everybody provides, maybe I need to have, I'm very happy with my bookkeeper, but maybe I need to move on because, at closing in on, eight-figure revenue, maybe my bookkeeping team needs to be upgraded. You know what I mean? Like these are the conversations that people need to be considering, I think, as you are growing and scaling. And it's not something that I necessarily want to do, but I owe it to the business to get better at each component of it, right?
Well, I would say there are some that are more glaring than others. I look back in the history of my firm administrators, and it was pretty ugly till I found a decent guy. The guy who's been with me for years, who's legendary and fell off the motorcycle. He's a guy who, before that, it was a bunch of buffoons that each had some strengths and got me to where I needed to be. But I think there's also a question of are you paying enough for some of those areas? True with the marketing side, right? If you're paying your SEO vendor, $4,000 a month, and all your competitors have $20,000 or $15,000 worth of resources, is it the budget or is it the vendor?
Right.
And that's also true with the software, right? If you have software that is $80 for your entire firm per month, it may be that it's not the same
Yeah.
technology as somebody who's investing every month in doing that. And same with the bookkeeper. Like if you have a bookkeeper that's making $70,000 a year, nothing wrong with that number, but that if you want somebody who has junior controller elements in them, that's going to be closer to 80 to 100. And if you want, mid-level controller, it's going to be a buck
Buck
25. And there's,
25.
and so
Right.
that to a certain extent, occasionally you get somebody who's undervalued for whatever reason, but that very often the question and it goes exactly to your question, which is, are you layering, are you budgeting what's needed to get it done? And I see that over and over again.
And my point is, how do you know that? What resources are out there to tell us, hey, if you're at once you cross, $5 million worth of revenue for your firm, once you cross $10 million, you should be looking for a controller type that's a buck 50 a year because that, with those types of revenue, once you are at $7.5 million worth of revenue, you should have X, Y, and Z, and they generally cost them out about this much. Because
And one thing I'll tell you, again,
what's
I
out
don't
there
know
to
if you,
tell us those answers to those questions other than trial and error? And we're trying to make it so that people don't make the same errors that other people make by being public about this stuff.
I would say, and I'm not telling you that I did this, but I remember way back in the day, we looked at our percentage of accounting fees, of internal accounting fees, from the firm's point of view, like meaning as a percentage of revenue. And it was very, very low. Same with marketing. if you're sitting there and you're like, okay, are you in growth mode, sustain mode, what, and actually looking at what are you spending as a percentage of revenue? That is one of those areas that you could look at to give you a heads up as to should you be investing more in something. If you're underspending there, now if it ain't broke and you have that bookkeeper and you don't see any major issues and your CPA is good with everything, great.
Just keep rolling.
Right. But
Yeah.
let's say you want to start forecasting and that current person can't do that. Then one of the great things, and I think that the industry has developed, and I don't, not that I have amazing rep people for each of these, but that's where fractional people can be great because, a real CFO is 250 to $300,000 a year. And most of us don't want to spend that. And so the question is, can you find somebody? And I guess the frustrating piece that I have seen is that there are business models within business models. And then you have to be a student as to what are you getting for what? And are you getting, and this is no different for SEO as it is for fractional CFOs, are you getting that person or are you getting the team below them? And is that team, if the team below them is crushing it, great, and that person's directing it, that's the dream. But that's another layer to this when you're evaluating and when you're figuring these pieces out that, when you look at people that you're working with and look, softwares, imagine if you were with, I was back in the day with, you had Needles and you had TrialWorks, right? And then they merged,
Yep.
and then TrialWorks just, I never went to Needles because they never improved it, even though my mentors
I think they
made
just went to
bank.
the cloud recently.
Right, but my
Yeah.
mentors made bank on Needles because back in the day when PI was easier, they just crushed it and they loved it. And then
Right.
they merged, and then they didn't do anything with TrialWare, and then they merged again. And so there are times when I think you want to look at the company itself and say, is the company itself stable? Is it investing in innovation? Is this somebody who's going to be able to get me there? And that's again, I think the benefit of cloud software, even though it's expensive as shit, is that in theory, you're not waiting for that annual update. You remember that? Where like you'd have to pay for an annual update to your software. It was much more cost effective, but it wasn't in real time. And the incentives weren't as great to keep it up to date.
Gotcha. I mean, the reality is that it's just, these are the challenge, I guess, is these are the problems of every business owner. And it's like your business is living, breathing, and you never know if you're really in growth mode or sustain mode until you actually see what the results are. I entered 2024 thinking that I was going to be in sustain mode, and we tweaked some of our paid stuff, our pay-per-click and our LSAs. And we're only 6 weeks into the year, but we're seeing 37% growth January over January. And so it's one of these things that I went in thinking I was in sustain mode, and now I'm really in growth mode. And so now I have to reevaluate, is this something I want to continue all year? And if I do, what sort of resources do I need to do? I had to juggle some of my staff to make sure that we have the right people on intake because the calls are coming in.
Well, right,
And
because to me, that's why I love investing in intake, because in theory, you could invest in intake and sell differently, like meaning raise prices and change your rubric and not really grow headcount wise. And
but
if
grow
you
revenue
do,
wise.
and just and keep it with, because look, with 44 lawyers, I just had a lawyer who had a meltdown, and it's just again, it's not like it's not the sky is falling, but it's like as with every layer of growth, there's additional potential room for headaches.
Yeah, I mean, it's just it's one of these things that a couple of weeks ago, end of the year, I was like, okay, I'm in a good space. I fixed my problems of last year, and let's just coast. We're happy where we're at. We're happy with our numbers, and I'm getting frantic calls from my sales person saying, we can't keep up with all of these leads. And every time we quote hire, people pay us. I mean, it's a good problem to have, knock on wood,
But I
right?
think that's one of the only ways you can get there because if they didn't have that excess leads, they would not have the wherewithal. They wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
So, hey,
Yeah.
this
I
is
mean,
awesome. I really enjoyed this, and I can't wait for Tech Show. I'll come back with all sorts of whatever's new and breaking there. I did. This is
yeah,
one that I don't go for business development. I really just go to sort of geek out and
see what's there
yeah,
and
and
see
and
what
connect with the other people who are doing those things who normally are off. The people that you can't normally get real FaceTime with normally.
yeah, I'm sure there's going to be a ton of AI products
Right.
out
And
there.
to me, it's always sifting between what is AI that's, you know, cool. Is the shiny object saying it's AI versus which is the ones that are actually moving the needle with it. I mean, so much out there where people are saying it's AI, but there's really a bunch of guys in India doing the work because
Right.
nobody wants to pay for that, but they'll pay for AI. So it's just fascinating to see those things start to roll out and what's real and what's and like anything else, I mean, I never want to buy a software in its first year. It would be great to have that stuff. And I know it's coming and I'm not running away from it, but I also want to make sure that we get the stuff that's legit and not, half
Right.
baked.
You don't want to bet on a platform that just breaks down in 18 months and you've lost time and money. So it's one of these things that you kind of have to you have to be cautious before just jumping into something for sure.
Absolutely. Let's wrap this up and
All right.
land the plane, as they say.
Well, folks, this is going to be a great episode if you want to just think about, where you are going intentionally. Of course, if you want to take us on the go, you can do it anytime by subscribing to the Law Firm Blueprint podcast and take your shows on the go. Of course, you can also join our Facebook group, which is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, wherever you get Facebook. You can join the group and follow along on this show every week as we go live broadcasting that. But that's going to do it for me. I'm Jay Ruane. He is Seth Price. We are the Law Firm Blueprint. Thanks so much for being with us. Bye for now.